Right, well, thank you, Anthony, for that introduction. And let me also welcome Justin E.H. Smith to this digital lecture series of The Philosopher. And today we'll be talking about your new book, as Anthony said, The Internet Isn't What You Think It Is, a history, a philosophy, a warning. So I guess my first question is, how do you think most people think about the internet, and why is it the wrong way to think about it?
Well, I suppose there are, first of all, thanks for agreeing to enter into this conversation with me, and I'm delighted to be here this evening. The title of the book is borrowed from the first sentence of chapter 2. It's not the title I initially proposed, but my editor liked it so much that we went with it, and he knows best when it comes to marketing questions. I wanted to call it The Living Mirror, a philosophy of the internet. The living mirror being a reference to the metaphysics of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and I hope we'll get back to that at some point later today. So we lifted this from the book itself, and in chapter 2, it means one thing, whereas in the context of the rest of the book's project, it means something very different. So let me give you the two different respects in which the internet is not what you think it is. First, the original occurrence in chapter 2. There, I try to push as far as it can possibly be pushed the natural analogy, the analogy in a very Kantian sense, to think of the internet in continuity with several different instances of what we might identify as instantaneous transmission of signals across living nature, and to suggest that we might do better to think about the internet as a kind of excrescence or outgrowth of a species-specific activity. And the big sticking point with that is that within animal or plant signaling, and I give various examples of lima bean plants giving off methyl jasmonate that floats through the air to their conspecifics, and sperm whale clicking, which apparently can, we think now, be heard in the Atlantic Ocean when it's emitted in the Pacific Ocean. So this is true telecommunication. The big difference between our telecommunications in such cases is obviously that we haven't always been doing it, right? So it's we're late adopters in some respects, but in other respects, what we're doing phenomenologically and psychologically when we do this, that is when we get on the internet and fight with people on social media or whatever, except for the new distortions by algorithm, this is something very kind of archaic, and I would argue with us there from the origins, right? So I'm trying again to push this and to show, you know, some years ago in the media, there was some flurry of interest in what was catchily called the Wood Wide Web, looking at mycorrhizal fungus networks that attach to the roots of trees and that enable them to communicate with one another, even if they appear to be at a distance, and in some cases to warn one another and to block non-conspecifics and so on. So complicated stuff going on down there. So again, that's an analogy, but the book is really a reflection on the limits of analogy to tell us what a given thing is. So much like I like to say, in the 20th century, people reflected on philosophy of cinema, right? Which today sounds like a very antiquated undertaking, but typically one would try to look at its ancestors, like still photography, the realist novel, various tendencies in painting, 19th century shadow plays, and so on. But one would also want to take seriously the kind of enduring quality of certain analogies, like, for example, the idea that cinema is like unto a dream, that Hollywood is the dream factory, and so on. What is the significance of that? Some authors have tried to work that out, and I'm effectively trying to do that by analogies with nature in chapter 2 of the internet of my book, where I say the internet is not what you think it is.
So so on the one hand, you have this argument, and we'll come to that in more detail in a minute, that we usually think of the internet as a technology, something that we invent, an artifact, but you're pushing this argument that maybe we should be thinking it more as analogous with things that are naturally occurring. What's the second way in which we misunderstand the internet, and what's your...
The second way is that it's what denaturalizes it, what you might say, if you want to use moralistic language, is what perverts and distorts it, is that it is at present dominated by economic interests that are beyond or that are counter to any kind of human thriving, right? In particular, the fact that we're constrained to communicate and debate through media that are explicitly profit-driven, and that it has turned out to be in the interest of extracting more profit to abandon the old model that I still remember from Facebook circa 2007, which is what we sometimes call the fire hose news feed, right? Where you have a list of friends, and whoever's your friend, you see their posts in the order they post them, and basically nothing else. The fire hose was abandoned circa 2012, 13. I don't know exactly when, but things started looking weird. They started looking like a distorted image of the information that I knew for other reasons the people in my network were actually trying to get across to me. And it just got worse and worse. And then by the middle of the last decade, the general perception was that social media were not a neutral medium of communication, but rather something like a distorting mirror, to use some of Gia Tolentino's language, something that was essentially misrepresentation of the reality around us. So that now, when I talk about the internet in a kind of narrower sense, sometimes I call it the phenomenological internet, which is primarily social media, right? Like what we spend most of our time staring at. Now we're in this terrible situation where it's de facto the only game in town. It's the only choice you have. You can go publish pamphlets or whatever if you want, but good luck getting heard. Your luck there is even smaller than, if you fire off tweets, but you don't have a following and you're not an influencer and you fail to go viral. So we're in this situation where we have something that's actually more like a discourse or deliberation themed video game, where the real function is to rack up points in the game, though we don't call the points, we call them likes or followers or faves or something like that. And we're supposed to be pretending that it's not a deliberation themed video game, but the actual public space in which rational deliberation can be pursued. And given that it's the only choice we have, some people play along with that. I have decided, for my own taste, I'm still on social media, but I'm of the deep conviction that social media is only good for shitposting and not for serious exchange. So I will never exchange on matters of content with anyone. I refuse. It won't work. it will only make things worse. So that's the other respect in which it's not what you think it is.
Yeah.
You think you're exchanging ideas, you're not. You're playing a game.
Well, this corner of the internet, let's hope, is more apt for exchanging and discussing ideas. So
yeah,
let's talk a little bit about the first analogy that you try and draw between the internet and nature. So I think it's fair to say most of us think of the internet, as you said, as a kind of tool, as an artifact, as a technological creation, not really as part of human nature. But as you pointed out, it is true that we are increasingly reaching out for these analogies when thinking about the internet, and a lot of them have to do with, the way that the roots of trees are interconnected underground and exchange all these kinds of, exchange information with each other about predators or the passing away of a tree, from what I remember from having read on this. So my question, I guess, is people are often accused of, anthropomorphizing nature, right? We project onto nature things that we see that are similar to things that we know from our behavior. We project ourselves onto it. So I was wondering whether here we have the danger of the opposite being the case, right? Are we reading too much into our own artifacts that we see in nature, seeing them as being just part of nature, as plants and trees are?
Right. Well, look, I mean, I'm prepared to say that for the sake of argument that lima beans are not conscious, right? And that when they're sending methyl jasmonate signals or whatever, they're not on the receiving end experiencing what we would call aboutness or intentionality or anything like that. And that's, we tend to think that the internet by itself is just a bunch of electrical signals going back and forth. But then on the receiving ends, at the terminal points, there is an experience had by a conscious subject, right? And it's the experience we're interested in analyzing. I wouldn't say that sperm whales and elephants, other great telecommunicators, are unconscious. I think they're literally doing the same thing we're doing when we communicate at a distance. But what I want to say is, isn't it possible, given that we know that there are such networks, that they are deeply embedded in our evolutionary history, that the quality of experience at the receiving ends or at the terminal points of the network should rather be seen as a later kind of overlay upon something that is already in place and already well set up by nature itself, long before experience comes into question, right? And if that's the case, then the continuity between lima bean signaling and sending a sext or whatever is not just an analogy so much as an extremely recent addition in a very long process.
Well, how do we know? So this sounds appealing, and it's an interesting story of continuity between the human realm and the rest of nature, which we often like to separate in philosophy, and philosophy is often kind of falls prey to that sin. But how would we be able to distinguish, in your view, between that which is natural and that which is technological, that which is just part of human nature and that which changes human nature or transforms it in some way? Because there's a lot of talk about how the internet is literally changing the way our brains are wired, how much attention we can give to things, how we absorb and process, information. And then there's also the kind of transhumanist sort of side to all this, which is like maybe at some point we'll implant chips and, the internet will be, very directly accessible just by thought, and we'll be able to do all sorts of things that we can't do now. So how do we know whether something is just an expression of our nature, and when is it something that is changing that or distorting it?
Well, that's why I think, again, pushing the argument of chapter 2, and this is really only in chapter 2 that I pursue this, pushing it as far as we can is really interesting, because obviously, again, sperm whales have always clicked. We have not always clicked, so to speak. And so obviously there is a significant disanalogy there, or so we think. But then the question is, and this is where, I mean, we have to kind of plunge deeper into the philosophy of technology and also maybe the phenomenology of telecommunication, right? It's not clear to me that if you read, say, paper correspondences in the 17th century Republic of Letters, for example, that they're experiencing the kind of lag time between sending and receiving any differently than we do with emails. That is to say that what counts as simultaneity is itself conditioned by the state of technology, right? So that as long as there have been exchange networks, which is to say, as far as we know, as long as there've been as long as the 60,000 years or so since the so-called sapient revolution, there has been kind of long distance signaling of group affiliation and so on. Whether you actually have to walk across that distance in order to send the signal, or whether there are other technological means, what you still have, again, in a species-specific way, is a sort of experience of a broader community of kind of simultaneous, dispersed similarity or likeness, a network, as I think the best term to use. Right. So it's in that respect that if you really think about it, if you really push it, the mechanisms change, and they get in some respects faster and better, but in other respects we're still doing something very species specific. Now, of course, we're also messing up our brains and our faculties of attention, and this is leading to severe cognitive disruption. The best evidence, as I understand it, suggests that this is temporary and reversible. That is to say that you can retrain your brain pretty fast to start memorizing epic poetry or doing anything you might have been doing if Twitter hadn't come along and eaten your brain. So it's hopefully not leaving an evolutionary mark in the way that other contemporary industrial agriculture and so on are having also significant effects. And so eating is also something we do naturally. You could ask similarly, but yeah, isn't McDonald's a distortion of that? Well, in some respects it is, but in some respects it's still eating, right? That maybe that's a good way of thinking about how far this can be pushed.
So as Anthony mentioned earlier, you're the host of a podcast called What is X? And of course, that's the kind of traditional question that we find in Plato's early dialogues. And it's usually interpreted as requiring the sort of necessary and sufficient conditions for defining a concept, right? What is the definition of something? So, so I was going to ask you, what is the internet? But of course, your book suggests that you can't really just answer that question. And it reminded me a little bit of that Nietzsche quote in The Genealogy of Morality, where he says that only things without a history have a definition. And in your mind, the internet has a history, both perhaps an evolutionary history, but also a kind of human history. Why do you think we need to understand the history of the internet in order to understand something that we use and interact with every day of our lives? Why is that a necessary kind of background?
Incidentally, my favorite quote from Nietzsche that could be extended to the internet is, "You seek followers, seek zeros," right? Which is wonderful, because the idea is like, this is like you can buy followers from a click farm, for at a bulk rate, right? They're nobodies, they're fictions, and it sounds like Nietzsche is talking about that. He's not, of course. So I suppose, the Nietzsche's insight about genealogy and definition is exactly right. And again, here I would want to follow very much in the footsteps of at least some people who have worked on the philosophy of film, right? And who want to understand it in continuity with, in particular, with various 19th century art forms and the way they come into contact with various new technologies, right? But then beneath that, you still want to ask other questions of film. For example, what is it we are experiencing when we're experiencing film? And very much in the same way, you could not possibly begin to answer that question without talking about history. Right. And as I see it, the two are not in conflict. The definition is still a definition. It's just long because you have to rewind. How far back do you have to rewind in order to give an account of what the internet is? I think that there are certain respects in which you have to rewind hundreds of millions of years, and that's more the telecommunication side of it. But of course, telecommunication is not the full definition of the internet. Telephony, telegraphy are not the internet. They're part of the story, and the other part of the story is information processing, machine information processing. And there you have to go back to, I can give you a very precise date, 1678, the Leibniz's, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's most active period in developing a reckoning engine and conceiving, at least as a possibility, the translation of all information into sequences that could be mechanically processed by the reckoning engine. Now, this isn't actually developed until the 1830s with Babbage and Lovelace, but one of the themes I like to play on in the book is this ridiculous phrase that they like to use in Silicon Valley: proof of concept, right? Like a concept is itself the proof of concept, right? Because, you know, if I have the concept, I can prove that I have it, right? So what they mean when they say proof of concept is proof of the physical realization of the thing of which there was earlier a concept. And there has been a concept of machine reasoning or outsourced reasoning at least since 1678. And this started to elide with dreams of telecommunication in the early to mid 19th century, right? And so it's important, I think, to study the people who are in the dreaming period of a technology, because that's where, I mean, this might sound like an idealist history of technology, and one might oppose it for that reason, but that's where you start to understand why people were trying to make this happen in the first place. And what you detect in someone like Leibniz is it's because they think that it would fit with the nature of reality itself, right? That the world is an interconnected network, and that if we were to develop a technology that depended on that, it would be more of a kind of tapping into what the cosmos already is like, rather than an artifice where one constrains nature to do something that it wouldn't ordinarily be doing. And in that respect, again, if we take Leibniz as our ancestor figure for the history of the internet really is doing something quite natural, both in a human sense and in, so to speak, a cosmic sense.
Yeah, that brings me to the opening quote of your book, or one of the opening quotes of your book, which is a Leibniz quote, in which he talks about how sort of each thing that exists is in some way connected to everything else. and that through these connections, everything somehow is an expression of everything else, a perpetual living mirror of the universe, he called it.
Right.
And I take it from your comment earlier that you would have liked this to be the title of your book, that you think this is a kind of a good metaphor for the internet.
Yeah.
But then you also talked about the internet as a distorting lens. So to what extent can we think about the internet as a mirror of realities representing the way things are? And to what extent is it perhaps increasingly today a kind of distorting lens through which reality is filtered through and not really mirrored?
Well, again, I mean, this is a strange periodization, but my history of the internet would be like this. Chapter 1 extends from 1678 to about 2011 or 12, right? And chapter 2 extends from 2011 or 12 to today, right? I'm obviously exaggerating, and you could obviously insert other periodizations in there. I think Norbert Wiener's cybernetics in the mid 20th century is crucial for expressing some of the limits of what had previously been pure Leibnizian optimism about this project. But Leibniz, with his famous declaration, calculemus, let us calculate, sincerely believed that by outsourced machine processing of ideas, we could use our reason for relaxation and recreation and enjoyable things like geometry. And funny idea of enjoyment, but still, you could outsource hard problems, like Leibniz actually said, diplomatic deadlocks. So two empires about to go to war, they just enter in their respective arguments, and the reckoning engine churns out some kind of ticker tape or something and tells you which empire is right. And both sovereigns say, oh, okay, no more war. We know who's right, which of course is absurd. And war doesn't work that way. And we know that very clearly today, especially today when cyber warfare is actually part of the package of war in a literal sense today, right? And Norbert Wiener started to have some premonitions of this, even as he remained quite Leibnizian. But again, I think I can remember from my own lifetime in the 1990s, people talking about this, what sounds so dorky now, the idea of being a netizen, as if deliberative democracy and everything kind of that we think of as kind of underlying civil society could easily be transferred to the internet, transferred and therefore improved. 2011, we have the Arab Spring, the beginning of the various revolutions throughout the Arab world that early on are said to be proof of concept that Twitter is a force for world peace and democratic, bloodless political change. That disintegrates very quickly into violence. And then, of course, by 2015, you have Brexit and Trump and the very, very plain in-your-face evidence that these tools are not doing what some of the more optimistic people as late as the 1990s or 2000s thought they were going to be doing. And what people were saying in the 1990s and the aughts was, I take it, the swan song of Leibnizian optimism, and the world is very, very different now.
Before we go maybe into talking about sort of Twitter and all the ills that come with it, let's talk about something which you think is a sort of good part of the internet, which is Wikipedia, which is this kind of like online, endless library of information. But at the same time, I think you're relatively sympathetic to a sort of something that's become a bit of a cliche, and namely that we're drowning in information, but we're starved of knowledge or wisdom.
Yeah.
And you play with this know thyself imperative of the Oracle of Delphi, and then of course Socrates. And knowing thyself, then meant kind of knowing knowledge as a gateway to wisdom.
Yeah.
But there's also this argument that today we have this too much knowledge, and especially when it comes to ourselves. You mentioned, all these kind of Fitbit-like devices that record our blood pressure and our cholesterol levels and all that sort of information about how we slept and how many times we sneezed or coughed at night. How is all that side of the internet sort of also sabotaging us in some way or distorting? It's giving us a picture of reality. It's reflecting reality. But it's a hindrance in some ways rather than a help.
I mean, it's hard to deny that it is extremely interesting to know your stats from moment to moment and day to day. And it does feel like a sort of self-knowledge. Like, I don't want to say that that's not self-knowledge. And of course, Leibniz was obsessed with measuring the salinity in your bathwater from day to day. And there's a long tradition of kind of medical eudaimonism in rationalist philosophy that is, would have loved the Fitbit, right? But there are tech bros who go much further than just the heart rate and the snoring and stuff like that. They want devices that analyze your blood sugar level automatically every 15 minutes, that will then tell you when to eat and so on. And all of that might be interesting, except that typically this is very much in lieu of reflection on our existential predicament or any kind of engagement with concepts, right? The new quant culture, as we call it sometimes, that has emerged out of this technological conjuncture is not really good at engaging with concepts. That's a blunt statement, and I could offend some people, but I'm just going to stand by it. So that's one aspect of this. Now, as to Wikipedia, I've noticed a cognitive transformation in myself 20 years ago. This is the example I like to use. 20 years ago, if I were walking down the street and I wondered to myself, what is a quasar anyway? I don't know what a quasar is exactly. I'm not an astronomer. I would probably just have said to myself, maybe I'll learn someday. I'll try to remember the next time I have the opportunity to ask someone who knows, right? Or the next time I'm in a library or whatever. But I probably would have forgotten, and I probably would not have known what a quasar is. Now, I pull my phone out, and within 10 seconds, I have a basic idea of what a quasar is. And I do that all the time, compulsively, such that I don't know when I first got a smartphone, maybe 2008 or so, over the past 14 years, I think it's fundamentally changed my cognitive capacity and my relationship to the world. And in some respects, it's made me smarter, right? Like I can feel Wikipedia just, going straight into my veins. But in another respect, it's obvious that something has been lost as well. And this is a cognitive revolution that I think is best studied in comparison with the previous cognitive revolution of the so-called Gutenberg era, right? And many wonderful historians have worked on this. I can cite Anne Blair, the early modern book historian, who writes about early modern information overload. Also, of course, Francis Yates, the wonderful historian who wrote The Art of Memory in the 1960s about what had been lost when people started using books as as cognitive prostheses, right? Like I don't have to memorize a whole body of knowledge, a whole scientia. I can just put it on my shelf and pull it off when I need it. That was already the beginning of a tremendous cognitive transformation. And something comparable is underway right now, but much more extreme and really hard to pin down because we're right in the middle of it, and the dice have yet to fall, right? Exactly.
Okay, let me ask you a last question before we move on to the Q&A of the audience. This is a fascinating kind of genealogy and history of the internet, and you know, it certainly enriched my understanding of how I think about it. But I guess the question that philosophers are often asked is, well, is any of this sort of actionable? So can understanding the internet better protect us from the internet? So, you know, you're a self-diagnosed Twitter addict. You express concern about how algorithms seem to be taking over our agency when it comes to, you know, what music we listen to, what books we happen to bump into, what podcasts we might discover. So how does understanding the internet, its history, and perhaps the way in which it's been distorted since 2011 help us kind of protect ourselves from the internet?
Well, I mean, I say that this is a real via negativa in this book. I mean, I'm not a policy person. I don't know what should be done exactly. I think in some way or other, social media are going to have to be reconceived as a public utility with democratic oversight, in particular over how the algorithms favor certain declarations over others. And until that happens, we're in a really bad situation. On the other hand, I would probably not like to see governments seize the social media corporations overnight and proclaim them officially a public utility. So I don't know what to do. It's a serious question of political economy that is beyond my ken. I admit. I can help diagnose the problem and urge other people, maybe who are smarter than I am, to come up with a positive program for what comes next. But I did want to insist at least on kind of rejection of any accusation of Ludditism or of primitivism or anything like that. And that's why you get this coupling of the insistence that in some sense we're doing something rather species specific and continuous with what we've always done. And in another sense, it is a distortion and a perversion, right? So let's try to hone and better draw out the part that is species specific and conducive to human thriving, and fight back against the part that is distorting.
Okay, thank you for your answers to my questions, but now the audience has its own questions, one of which was something I also wanted to ask you about, in fact. So Joanna is saying, hi, Justin, your book clearly engages with a lot of disciplines, but you refer to the project also as a philosophy of the internet.
Yeah.
And she was wondering, what distinctive contribution does philosophy, as opposed to, say, history, makes to your project?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I refer to it as a history, a philosophy, a warning. So it's all three. And I am a philosopher by formation. I've been for some years now in a history and philosophy of science department. And part of what that means is that I don't spend too much time thinking about whether I'm doing history or rather philosophy. I do both at the same time. And unlike some of my analytic philosophy colleagues, I'm not over anxious to get to the philosophical where's the beef moment, right? Where you prove why it's philosophically valid. And I think, I mention Foucault's notion of genealogy in the introduction and the reasons why we might think of genealogical investigation as itself a sort of doing philosophy. But that said, I mean, isn't, let's say, the maximally zoomed out approach where you try to get as far away from your object in order to see how it, as Rorty would say, hangs together with others. Isn't that philosophy? I hope so. Anyhow, I'm prepared to say it is. And one more thing, this book is also in subtle ways, particularly in chapter 2, but not only, very indebted to Kant's third critique and to the in particular the notion of natural technique that Kant develops there. And so I do think that there are original philosophical contributions in the book, whether they're right or not, whether they're valuable or not, I don't know. But you know, I do try to say something new for philosophers, even if I don't spend too much time worrying about staying pure as a philosopher.
Okay, so next question is from Lou and says, I can't wait to read your book. My question concerns cultural relativism. Could we see different types of the internet in different cultures? Say South American internet is different from East Asian internet, which is different, say, from European internet. Or is this the case that the global reach has a strictly homogenizing effect?
Yeah.
And how does that relate to your diagnosis of social media?
Obviously, everything is in transition now, and my answer to this question is different than it even would have been during, say, the first pandemic lockdowns when I was writing it, because, you know, we're seeing in so many respects a retreat from globalization, and we can expect a general increase in what you might call cultural autarky in different global regions that will inevitably be expressed in the way people communicate online. I have a bit of experience with non-Anglo internet worlds, and one thing that often strikes me is that France is extremely behind the curve with many trends, and is in particular much more wary of having any kind of online presence than say homologues, counterparts in the Anglo world. I know very few French academics who are in your face on social media the way many Anglo academics are. I also spend a lot of time, even now, due to earlier linguistic training and interest, on Russian language social media. And what often strikes me there, and what makes me wonder about the limits of our current shift towards cultural autarky, is how similar online Russophone culture is to Anglophone culture. It's much more similar than French online culture is. And so I can't answer this question, but I think, you know, certainly Leibniz would have thought, and I would have thought until about 2011, and even in some respects until about February 2022, that this was a force for homogenization, but now it's not so clear. And I mean, I guess with the kind of Chinese heavy-handed kind of state private mesh for the purposes of surveillance, which has been clear for some years now, it's been clear that China has been going off in a different direction in terms of online culture. So all I can say is it's a complicated question, and we'll see how things develop. But right now, my inclination is to think it's less of a force for homogenization of the world than we would have thought. On the other hand, I was just in a nice Zoom session with an old colleague from Moscow a few hours ago, and it's kind of strange that no matter how separate we feel, we've still got Zoom, maybe with a VPN, but still, it's not, there's not a wall like there used to be. Anyhow, that's just another observation.
Our next question is about the attention crisis that you sort of referenced and caused by the internet. And the question is whether this is a topic of philosophical interest. Have philosophers thought about the nature of attention before? Or is this something that we're only kind of becoming alive to now, given that there is this kind of crisis that even philosophers feel? It's definitely harder for me to read long books than it was 5 or 6 years ago.
I mean, the section on attention is strongly influenced by a working group conference that I co-organized and put on at Princeton a year ago in March 2021 with my HPS colleague Graham Burnett. And we're coming out with a volume on this with some philosophers in it. Jonathan Ganeri is going to be in it, a couple of others. And so I got interested in the philosophy of attention, and in connection with a separate project that then cross-pollinated with the internet project. And so there, what I can say is, the philosophy of attention, if we see it, often see it starting in its full mature sense with William James, and then developing over the course of the 20th century in various tendencies in schools, and you get something very different in phenomenology than you get in experimental psychology. But in any case, it's safe to say that in the present moment, we have what you can call a crisis of attention. And this is, of course, there have been advertisements in urban landscapes for quite a while now. That's not new, as I like to put it in the, and there's I quote in the book this wonderful line from Nabokov's Pnin, where this Russian immigrant in the US refuses to read the Sunday paper because he declares, but I do not know what is advertisement and what is not advertisement, right? So it's like advertisement already in the 1950s is totally kind of seamlessly woven in to everything Americans produce, right? But the real crisis at the present moment is that the solicitations on our attention are at the same time reading us and kind of in a feedback loop with our faculty of attention in a way that maximizes, so they think or hope, the harmful, baneful exposures to the most inane sorts of advertisements and quasi-advertisements and para-advertisements that totally dominate the online landscape, right? There are theorists like Yves Citon, who wrote this wonderful book called The Ecology of Attention, who argue kind of from a more from a point of view more of political economy that the way the internet is now set up is it's literally an attention extraction economy, right? That our attention is being extracted in the same way that that one would extract oil or precious metals from a mine, right? Because this is now where the money is. And if that's true, then it's particularly significant economic revolution as well, because previously people were exploited, but typically they weren't exploited as the source of the natural resource itself. They were just the ones who had to go get the natural resource, right? So that's the real depth of the crisis of attention, which I personally think is more interesting, more serious, and more pressing than defending this or that theory of what attention is, right? Like the debates between Ganeri and Carolyn Dicey Jennings as to whether attention is the key through which we can come to understand whether there is a metaphysical self or not, right? I don't know. I mean, I touch on that stuff, but I'm not a philosopher of attention in that narrow sense.
I mean, talking about attention stealing technologies, one question is about the metaverse, which arguably might be even more immersive and more distracting than, you know, Twitter or Facebook are at the moment. The question is, what do you make of it? How does it relate maybe to what Leibniz would have expected in terms of this kind of parallel world? And a question I wanted to ask you in relation to this is whether you buy the Daniel Dennett's argument that, you know, everything that happens on the internet or on the metaverse is just as real as what happens in the physical world.
Well, I mean, a lot of that is pursued in the section, Do We See Through the Internet, which is a riff on Ian Hacking's wonderful 1983 article, Do We See Through a Microscope? Where he's talking about, you know, electron microscopes, and complicated instruments, scientific instruments that give you readings without really engaging your sense organs directly, right? And so, I mean, obviously, what I like to point out is you can, there's wonderful public resources on the website of NASA, where you can go and, you know, see images from satellite pictures of Saturn and whatever. And obviously, this is as good as what you're getting if you're at the observatory, right? Except that you're at home. And I'm sure the scientists themselves, in some cases, the observatory is in Hawaii and the scientist is in Texas or whatever. And so, you know, that's seeing through the internet at least as good as anyone can see the object that interests them, right? So of course it depends what you're looking at, but that is real in the way that Dennett means. And of course you can also really fall in love on the internet. You can probably get married or divorced on the internet. Teledildonics is a burgeoning field that makes intimate contact possible through the internet. That's real. All of this is real. I'm not going to, in fact, I would even go further. I agree with Dave Chalmers in his new book, Reality Plus.
I did mean Chalmers, yeah, not Dennett. Sorry, that was my.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I was stretching to see where Dennett might have said this, but it wouldn't surprise me. But so Chalmers, yeah, I mean, you know, if I'm sitting on a couch made of bits and pixels, or if I'm sitting on a couch made of atoms, if I'm really having the experience of sitting, then I'm sitting on a couch, right? Whatever its underlying constituents are. I'm happy to go along with that, but I think that the leap from that to a defense of the Bostrom-style simulation argument is just totally irresponsible nonsense, right? The fact that I can have a VR experience of a couch, and that's enough to call it a couch, is not itself an argument that the couch I'm currently sitting on is VR, right? You need a lot more than just that to convince me that the world is a computer simulation. And I think that is just tech industry, hot air, and Chalmers has got a whiff of it, and as now a certain number of philosophers have, but it will pass.
And what do you make of the idea of the metaverse? Do you think it's a sort of gimmicky thing that is not going to really make a splash, or are we going to be talking about a new age of the internet after that arrives on our well?
I mean, I honestly, when I saw Zuckerberg's release of this first vision of the metaverse, I thought they must be doing some weird marketing strategy here, like making it look as dorky and clunky and behind the times as possible, because there's no way this could take us all in, right? I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. I mean, obviously, the augmentation of reality is going to continue in all sorts of ways with our devices, and I'm fully expecting implants soon. But you know, our sense organs have always been augmenting reality. Reality doesn't look like you actually like it appears to you, and philosophers have known this all along. And so it's kind of silly to say that the problem really only gets going at a certain moment in the history of technology. It doesn't. And I mean, you know, it's facile to say that, say, the Matrix is anticipated by Plato's allegory of the cave. But if you twist it in another direction and you say, well, actually, what the allegory of the cave shows is that the technology of fire is already quite enough to get you thinking about appearance reality distinctions, right? That's a good way, another way of kind of working your way into this longue durée sensibility, where our current problems in our current technological conjuncture start to make more sense.
To take it back to the beginning, maybe, of our conversation, does that mean that you don't think transhumanism is a possibility for us? Are we just incapable of transcending our nature? No technology will ever do it. It will always just be a version of something that was always with us.
Well, look, I mean, let's take an extreme case. I don't believe what Dave Chalmers nicely calls DigiDave, right, or downloaded Dave is any kind of real possibility, right? You cannot transfer your personal identity to silicon substrate. Why not? Well, because your personal identity fundamentally depends on your embodied experience, which includes your memories, right? And so you might program a computer to talk like you, but it's not going to be you. It just will never happen. And I'm confident in saying that. I think, obviously, if we have implants and augmentations of various sorts, there's going to be a question of whether this, again, is trance or whether it's more, right? More of the same but better, or at a greater scale, or something like that. And I think we're definitely going to see more and more of that. But transhumanism implies, to my mind, scenarios in which the human drops out of the picture altogether, because you no longer have lived embodied experience. But if you no longer have that, then you no longer have yourself, and you no longer have a subject to talk about who is no longer human, right? You see the problem? So in that respect, I'm not a fan of transhumanism. No, I think it's based on science fiction enthusiasms that don't really stand up to conceptual scrutiny.